making this presentation possible. The Oregon League arose in the same year, 1920, as the national organization, born of the victory after a long fight for equal suffrage and the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, assuring full voting rights to women. The Oregon League has brought state voters essential information and important insights over the years with studies on education and school finance, government restructuring and taxation, child care, and public health. Becky Cain has served as president of the National League since 1992. She headed the West Virginia League in the mid-1980s before joining the National League Board in 1988. She's a very active leader. She's taken the League's views to the national and local media, to civic organizations, and to Congress. And throughout the country has given numerous interviews and presentations speaking out on such key issues as motor voter registration and health care. Please join me in welcoming Becky Cain to the City Club of Portland.
Thank you. Thank you, Don, and it is a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak with you today, an organization that cherishes, as the League does, public debate and dialogue and study of community issues, and believes that indeed that people should participate in their community, and not only believes it but actually does it. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I know that the League here in Portland has taken on a couple of projects with you from time to time, and what an honor it is for me to be here. The 1996 elections are coming up, and in fact, as they heat up, the voters are going to face intense scrutiny again by politicians, political consultants, pollsters, and pundits. The 1994 elections brought revolution to the House of Representatives, and government divided once again between parties. Now, after the first 100 days of the 104th Congress, everyone wants to know what that sort of elusive, mysterious, yet all-powerful entity, the American electorate, thinks of its new Congress. Well, we won't find the answer reading the polls, since they are telling us very little about the electorate. Polls show us what most Americans think. But in 1994, as in all midterm elections, most Americans didn't vote. 6 out of every 10 citizens stayed at home on Election Day last year. So let's not confuse the voters' perspective with that of the people. When we talk about the voters' perspective, we also need to distinguish which voters we mean. Are we speaking of the 76 million voters who voted in 1994, the 104 million who voted in 1992, or the 68 million who voted in 1990? After all, 2/3 of the current Senate was elected in 1990 and 92. All 3 electorates together, not just the most recent electorate, created the current government and the divisions within the government. This distinction is really critical because the 1994 electorate looks very different from the 1992 electorate. In 1994, there were fewer African American voters. In the 1992 presidential elections, 11% of the electorate was black. This number dropped to 9% last year. In addition, among blacks who did vote, fewer voted Republican in 1994. Also, fewer women turned out in 1994. In 1992, women made up 54% of the electorate. In 1994, they made up 51% of the electorate. 3 years ago, the gender gap in other words, the difference in voting patterns and gender, had a decisive impact on the election. There was little change in that gender gap in 1994. There still were some consistent patterns among voters according to gender. But since turnout among women was down, women's votes only decided the outcome in a very few races. The 1994 electorate was more male and less racially diverse than the electorate that voted for President Clinton. The 1994 electorate was also smaller. Turnout was up slightly in 1994, but only 1 percentage point above the average for the last 4 midterm elections. So there's reason to be happy, but we need a lot more reason to be happy. The total number of voters was still very small. Only 39.5% of the voting age population voted. Republicans won 50.5% of the national vote last year. This is not a landslide. On a district-by-district basis, and that's what really counts when you're deciding control of the House of Representatives, the election was incredibly close. If fewer than 20,000 voters had switched their votes in the 13 closest elections, Democrats would have maintained control of the House. Turnout on Election Day matters. Republicans owe their victory in the House to the well-organized, well-funded interest groups that got the vote out. The Christian Coalition, the Term Limits Movement, and the NRA did their jobs. You don't have to agree with their positions to appreciate how effective they were. These groups advertised the same message. They waged an us against them battle against the federal government. With few exceptions, their efforts were successful. They energized their constituents, and they turned them out on Election Day. The importance of turnout shows in one of the races that the Democrats did win. Senator Charles Robb won in Virginia, defeating Oliver North. North made his opposition to the federal government the centerpiece of his campaign. But this was a competitive, highly visible race in which both sides worked hard at the grassroots level to energize their constituents. Turnout was high, 50% for this race, the senatorial race in Virginia, and the electorate looked more like the 1992 electorate, with women concerned about the choice issue and African American leaders working to turn out supporters for Robb. Robb won. Once again, turnout matters. The folks that show up on Election Day really matter. As the next election approaches, the political consultants will certainly be analyzing the work that was done in 1994. In fact, they're already doing that. They will, and have indeed already know, that campaigning against government can be a highly effective tool. The campaign was like a great bellows sort of puffing away to fan the flames of suspicion, resentment, anger, and frustration. The voters, of course, had a right to be angry. The 103rd Congress, under Democratic rule, with no Republican president to blame, had failed to bring campaign finance reform or what the 1992 electorate had asked for, health care and welfare reform, up through the process. This justifiable frustration was expertly exploited in subtle and not so subtle ways. I know because I had the pleasure of speaking with and appearing on many radio talk shows to discuss term limits, which was a very hot-button campaign issue. And I can tell you from personal experience that people are angry. Term limits focused that anger. Many term limits supporters and activists earnestly believe that term limits offers a solution to the troubles that they see in Congress. Some want term limits because they believe that they will make Congress more effective. For many campaign consultants, however, the term limits movement was nothing more than a brand new shiny tool to be used to elect their own candidates, candidates with an anti-government message. As a result of these effective campaigns, Republicans were vaulted into the pilot seat in Congress, opposing the Democratic president. Did the 1994 electorate deliberately vote for divided government? No. Different electorates voting at different times led to our currently divided government. The 1994 divisions created another division as well, not only in Congress and having Congress divided from the executive in terms of party, the House is divided from the Senate. The defeat of the House Balanced Budget Constitutional Amendment in the Senate underscores this division. In the first 100 days, the conflicts between the House and the Senate, held by the same political party, over issues like the line item veto, regulatory reform, tax cuts, and welfare reform have made the division between the houses strikingly apparent. The real revolution that occurred in the 1994 elections was not the change in party. It was the change within the House of Representatives, specifically the rise to power of the anti-government wing of the GOP. The new division cuts between those who believe that the federal government has a positive role to play in our country and those who would cripple it. The legislative agenda of the new House can be traced directly to the groups who worked to energize the voters who gave Republicans their victory. On the first day of the 104th session, the House began working to undercut congressional power. After 20 minutes of debate on the first day of the congressional session, the House passed a rules change requiring a so-called supermajority vote to pass any income tax increases. In the fervor of the takeover, the rules change was really sort of a little blip on the national radar screen. And yet, if you look closely, you can see the agenda for the next 100 days spelled out in that deft legislative move. House Rule 21 requires a 3/5 majority vote to raise taxes, income tax rates. This was the first of many quick fix solutions that would be offered by the House. This one happens to be unconstitutional. Why? Because it turns the principle of majority rule on its head by handing over the most important power given to the House of Representatives, the power to lay taxes, to a minority of its members. This really was a constitutional change done through a legislative, in fact, a rule process, not even a legislative one. House Rule 21 is sort of like planned obsolescence. Its purpose is to tie the hands of the legislature. Nearly all tax legislation includes a tax rate increase, even if overall taxes go down in the legislation. Rule 21 ensures that all important tax legislation will be controlled by a minority of the members voting on the issue. House Rule 21 is a model piece of anti-government legislation. Like House Rule 21, much of the House's legislative agenda has but really one purpose: to undermine the role of the federal government. It's no accident we saw two constitutional changes proposed, the balanced budget and term limits constitutional amendments. These amendments promised the people more than a policy shift. They promised a radical power shift. Indeed, it's hard to find a piece of legislation, of House legislation, that does not shift power away from Congress. Block grants and unfunded mandates legislation transfers power to the states. Term limits and the line item veto transfer power to the executive. Regulatory reform transfers power to corporations to regulate themselves. The balanced budget amendment, as it passed in the House, would have transferred power to the courts. In working to legislate this anti-government agenda, the House was and is responding to the desires of the electorate that had cast the deciding ballots and the groups who had worked to get them their victory. It makes sense. Ironically, the speed and finesse with which this legislation was passed through the House does show that strong leadership can make the political process respond without a shift in power. Now, approval ratings for Congress have gone up, even though a majority of Americans have disapproved of the content of much of this legislation. This paradox is really no mystery. The public wants effective government. President Clinton, after all, won election with a campaign that promised positive, effective government. So what will the future hold? Will 1996 continue divided government, or will Congress and the presidency be held by the same political party? More important, will Congress and the president be held by officials who share a common outlook and philosophy on government? To answer these questions, again, we need to go back to the electorate. What will the electorate look like in 1996? We can be sure of one thing. In 1996, we will have a wholly new electorate. It's going to be much larger, more diverse, and more reflective of the population. Because of the National Voter Registration Act, known as Motor Voter, the electorate in 1996 will be substantially different. The new law, for those of you who are not familiar with it, requires states to offer citizens an opportunity to register to vote when they apply for their driver's license or for public assistance. It also requires states to offer the opportunity to register through the mail. In the first month, the states reported more than 500,000 new voter registrants. This number dwarfs the number from last January. The legislation became effective January 1, 1995. The reports for the first quarter of 1995 suggest that 2 million have now registered. Some are guessing and estimating that we'll have 20 million new voters in 1996. And as we see states like California, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Michigan begin to implement the law, we're going to see even more drastic increases. In 1996, as before, turnout will make the difference. Voters do make the fundamental decisions. The composition of the electorate, who votes, who's energized to vote, who's motivated to vote, will determine the outcome, and it does indeed determine the policies that are made in our country. For those who question whether they can make a difference, the statistics are there. Registering, voting, participating, as those of you here know, does make a difference. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about that, and I'd be happy to answer questions if that's appropriate.
Thank you, Becky, for a terrific contribution to our understanding of governance as it's currently playing out at the federal level, and a great setup for, I hope, some good questions for you from the audience. We'll begin with Alan Hunt, member of the board.
You have some wonderful data. It was quite interesting. I wonder if you could expand a little bit more on the voter anger. And my particular interest is the voters seem to be very angry toward the poor, the downtrodden, and wanting to cap social benefits. Any light that you could shed on that, I would appreciate.
I'd be happy to. I think the anger and frustration, as we have seen it as an organization, has been bubbling for quite some time. Regardless of who you ask, citizens believe that they're not being heard, that government is not serving them, and it doesn't matter which group of citizens or individuals that you talk to. They feel shut out of the system and have for quite some time. Whenever you ask, who do you believe controls the government then? If you don't, if individuals don't, if organizations like the City Club and the League of Women Voters can't have an impact, then who does control this thing if you as an individual don't either? They say special interest, and they define that very differently. So there seems to be a lot of discussion, as you mentioned, about the social programs, but there are also those who are just concerned that government has nothing to do with them and their life whatsoever. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The badge of courage was to not participate. I did not register. I did not vote. Don't blame me. That becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we don't speak up, and if we don't vote and we don't participate, we certainly can't expect government to represent us. If we don't tell them what we want, then they're not going to be able to know what that is. So it's sort of fed on itself, and I think that the frustration has now bubbled to the top, and hopefully we'll be able to take that anger and frustration and move it in positive ways to be able to get government to represent our needs and our concerns and to represent us the way we think it should.
I think Andy Sloop has the next question.
Andy Sloop, co-chair of the Technology and Business Committee. Can you look ahead to the year 2000 and beyond and tell us how online information services might affect the federal electoral process?
Yes. One of the, it can be a benefit, it can also be a hindrance in some ways. One of the concerns, much of the information that the government now provides in terms of public policy, in terms of rules and regulations, is actually required to be online so that you can access it through your computer, through the internet, through CompuServe, Prodigy, America Online, and all of those services. The concern is that that requires a particular type of delivery system. You've got to have the computer and the technology to do it. Will we create an information elite? Will those who have access to the information, because we all know that information is power, will those folks be able then to get into the process and be heard? What happens to the rest of the country? I think right now it's only something about 20% of the American population has access to those online services. What happens to the rest of the folks? The League of Women Voters has been working to make sure that we provide access in each congressional district. That's our vision for the future, for those who don't have the technology, so that you can get the information online. Not only can you get the information, you can email the White House, you can email your members of Congress. The downside of that, and to some degree, well, I guess that's a judgment value on my part, the consideration of the common good. If indeed we go to and move to direct democracy through an online service so that I can vote myself at home, never having to discuss anything with you other than access the information, if I so choose, online, and actually vote on an initiative or vote on a piece of legislation in Congress and go directly to the decision-making process, what does that do for the discussion of the common good? How does that sort of eradicate the common good if indeed we have a direct democracy without the opportunity to have dialogue with one another to find out, in West Virginia looks good to me, I don't know what it might do to Oregonians, but I'm going to vote my way. That I think is some of the concern as we travel down this road. It can be and it can work to strengthen the democratic process. More information, more opportunities to have our voice heard. The downside, if we're not careful, can be some will have it, some won't, and there will be little opportunity for the common good, which has always been the underlying belief in this country of a democratic process.
The floor is now open for not only members of the club, but those members of the league organizations that are here who may want to ask a question. First question?
Hi, Paul Farago, a City Club member, and welcome to Portland. The League of Women Voters filed lawsuits against term limit laws in Arkansas and Washington State. claiming that state-imposed congressional term limits are unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court will rule on this Arkansas case by June 26 at the end of the current term. Even though term limits is supported by 70% of American voters in the term limit elections, and arguably by that same percentage of women voters, if the Arkansas state-imposed congressional term limit is upheld by the Supreme Court, will the League continue to fund legal efforts against term limit laws? Will it seek to support state initiatives to overturn the state laws which will have been upheld? Will it ask Congress to overturn the state laws, or will it figure out how to manage under the constitutional term limit laws?
Well, that's easy.
Well, okay, that's a quickie, right? The League does oppose term limits, and we got into the issue because of our position on the balance of powers between Congress and the President. And in our study of the balance of powers, we felt that Congress is the people's body, and that it should be strong, and that it should be able to take positions separate and from the other two branches of government, particularly the President. And because of that, we oppose term limits because we feel that they're designed in some ways to limit and control the power of Congress, and we feel that Congress needs to be strong for the people. We believe that we have elections, and we have term limits, and they're called elections. That the most recent election is a prime example that if people want to make a choice, they can. That the voters don't need to be regulated. That how long in office is long enough ought to be up to us. So that if our members of Congress are serving us well, then that decision should be left up to the voters, and that they don't need to be regulated. We have participated, as you mentioned, in those court cases, and our plaintiff, and in fact the Hill in the federal, the one that's before the Supreme Court now, is a League member. And we believe the court will hear in our favor, and that it will be found unconstitutional. We will continue to oppose term limits for members of Congress in whatever appropriate manner that may be.
Next question, while we're waiting for it, I have been asked to make an announcement. One of you has put your parking ticket for the Bank of California lot into the the meal bowl. So you may be feeling well fed now, but in a half an hour you're in deep trouble. You can get it back from Melinda Canas, who is over here on the left side of the room, holding it up before it's over. Next question.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Let me ask this. Democracy requires an informed and involved electorate. And I believe you told us that in 1996 we can expect more and more diverse voters. I think the question is, are these voters going to be more informed and better informed in 1996? What do you think?
Well, we would hope so, because that's one of the roles we hope to play. So we hope we do a good job, and that's not a problem. One of the concerns, the League does believe in informed participation in the process, and works very hard to provide, as the City Club does, forums and opportunities for people to get access to the kinds of information they need to make informed choices, both on candidates and on public policy issues. The first step in the process in this country is to register. And that's the first time you become visible. In a campaign, the candidates naturally want to win, so they target their efforts to the people that they know will show up on Election Day. If you're not registered, they don't pay much attention to you, because they know you can't show up. Once you're registered, you become visible, because you have the potential to vote. If you have voted, you become a historical voter, and boy, are you visible, because they know you're going to show up. So they spend lots of time talking to you, either using whatever method they can, direct mail, access to cables that you might watch, radio shows that you listen to. So taking that first step and registering gets you into the system, and hopefully immediately will make you better informed than you were as an unregistered voter, because now you're visible and people are going to start talking to you. They're going to take your concerns to heart. So we believe that becoming registered is the first step in becoming informed. And again, we hope that we do as good a job as we have in the past in getting information out to folks so they can be informed.
I have a question from the audience while we're waiting for the next from the floor. Could you describe, please, the power of the religious right and its influence in getting out the vote and perhaps its influence in 1996?
Well, again, that is another very good, well-organized group of folks who did their homework and did do their, found their constituents and got them out. Again, I think as with in my presentation when we talked about the various groups that were concerned about the election who became angry and organized, this is certainly one of the groups that did it. And to the extent that we wonder why so much of the issues coming before Congress are those issues, it's directly related to who showed up and who made that election happen. And for many people who say it doesn't do any good for me to vote, it doesn't do any good for me to write my member of Congress, I think that this election shows it certainly does. They do hear you. You might get a form letter back. You may get an aide call you, but I've been in the offices and stood in the reception room and watched them tally up the list of the number of phone calls they get for and against whatever piece of legislation. Now, they may not remember that Becky Cain from St. Albans, West Virginia was the one that called, but my little mark will go in my column, and that's okay. So, you know, every group has that opportunity, and that's the wonder of this democratic society. We have to have, all of us who have concerns and commitments have to get to the point where we're willing to make this thing work. Democracy just doesn't happen on its own. It isn't an easy process. It's something that we have to be a part of, and if we want it to reflect us and our concerns, then we have to get in it.
Joella Whirlin, club member and also League of Women Voters member. I want to ask what might happen to, with regard to debates at the next presidential election. It's been very disappointing that the League, which I think was very effective for a while in staging presidential debates, has not been successful subsequently. So could you tell us something about the process that's been going on and what's happening behind the scenes and what you see coming up?
Sure.
Thank you.
The last debate that we did was in 1992. We did a presidential primary debate for the Democratic candidates right before the New Hampshire primary, so that we did do a presidential debate in 1992. We did not do any general election debates. The Bipartisan Commission on Presidential Debates delivered the last round of general election debates. Right now, we're looking at what we will do for election 96, and most of our efforts, frankly, will be targeted on a Get Out the Vote campaign. We're very proud of the efforts that we took to get the National Voter Registration Act passed, and for those who say that, well, those folks will never vote because they didn't jump all those hoops to get registered, we want to prove them wrong, so we want to make sure that people who have the opportunity actually do get to the polls. So we'll be working on a Get Out the Vote campaign. When the League started doing debates back in 1974, we were one of the only groups that could do it. There were so many restrictions from the Federal Election Commission, from the Federal Communications Commission, that in many ways it was almost as if that opportunity was crafted for our organization. We were delighted to do that and to take the lead on that. Now many of those restrictions are not there, and other organizations can do it, and we think the more the merrier, and we're happy to have anybody who wants to do a debate do so.
Good afternoon. Susan Ward, City Club member and League member. I had an opportunity not so long ago to listen to Mr. Putnam and his observation that there were more people bowling these days, but fewer people joining leagues. The League of Women Voters would like to have more members. I'm sure the City Club would as well. But how do you suggest that we take our message or include the community in our activities if the community seems to be preoccupied?
Well, I think we if you take a look at what the futurists say, that we're still going to continue to cocoon, we're still going to be wrapped up in ourselves and in our homes. So I think we have to find ways to get into our homes, and the gentleman who asked the online question, this is a great way to do it. use the telecommunications industry and all the things that are happening there to go into the homes so that people don't have to come out if they don't want to. We also have to find ways where they do choose to gather and make sure that we have an opportunity to speak to them or connect with them in those ways. Using radio, television, newspaper certainly are ways to enter again into their home or their place of work, their place of business, to reach them. It is no longer as easy to call a meeting and have folks show up. The sense of community, we've all talked about the sense of community and the lack of it, which again causes the league concern about the common good, and how do we find it if we're not willing to go out there and talk about it and put the issues before us and find out how things affect each of us. So I think that we have to think of creative ways, new ways to reach out and find out where people are and go to them. And the online opportunities are great, and so are radio and television. It means a different approach. Using cable TV is an excellent way. It may mean that we learn to use the soundbite a little differently and try to get information to people in the split second they give us. But I think it's going to take organizations like ours to come up with a way to do that, because this country's going to demand it. It's going to need it.
Chair Younger, League of Women Voters, and I had a question about campaign finance reform. I know that you have lobbied in support of that in regard to the National League. In Oregon here, we were a part of the coalition that passed and supported ballot measure 9, which passed in November. Currently, even today, we are testifying at the legislature to oppose a 52 or 72-page amendment which would basically gut campaign finance reform that was passed in November. Could you comment, please?
Sure. The League feels very strongly and has that there are things that need to be changed about our system, and one of them is campaign finance reform. That money, again, when we talk to people about why are you shut out, these so-called special interests are shutting us out. Much of that is equated to the amount of money that's spent in the process. It keeps good candidates from stepping up to bat because they either don't have access to that kind of wealth or don't want to spend the time and energy to get the wealth. Many candidates will tell you as soon as they win and take office, they immediately begin to fundraise for the next campaign. Instead of spending time governing, they're spending time raising money. So that money has become the driving force in the system. We have to find ways to get that out of the system so that we can have a level playing field for candidates, so more people will participate and so people will feel more connected. Some groups would tell you that candidates are bought. I'm not sure that there's a way to prove that or that's necessarily true. I certainly know that if I were a candidate and you had been a major contributor to my campaign and you called, and at the same time 20, 30 other people called, and I only had the opportunity to make one phone call back, I'd sure be hard-pressed to put you at the bottom of the list. So at least access may be tied to the money. And again, it's my understanding that Measure 9 was on the ballot in Oregon, and Oregonians spoke on that behalf, and that they were supportive of the measure, and in fact passed it overwhelmingly. So the need for change and should go the other way, frankly, in taking money out of the system instead of putting it back in. And in fact, I don't know how many of you know it, but the Senate, the U.S. Senate, in their budget discussion, balancing the budget, removed effective after the 1996, all of the provisions for public funding for the presidential campaign. So at a system where we have taken money out and given people an equal shot at it, the budget in the U.S. Senate removes the current system as we know it.
Good afternoon. Tom
Hi.
Palmersh. I'm a new City Club member. In the mid-'80s, John Kenneth Galbraith revised his classic book on the affluent society, and in it he implores us to put the elimination of poverty, and I quote, strongly, even centrally, on the social and political agenda. He goes on to say that the argument presuming the inefficiency of the state becomes the philosophical basis for our virtual surrender in the once championed war on poverty. Do you foresee a day when Congress, increasingly a bastion of suburban representation, will take up the cause of the poor, or have the electorate been thoroughly convinced that government inefficiency is so pervasive that our best hopes for an affluent society lie in an unregulated market system?
Well, it's interesting. Once again, the citizens have spoken both ways on that issue. When you ask some of the surveys that have been done, what is the number one problem with the government and why do they feel so angry about it, they will tell you it's mismanagement was the number one issue, but primarily among males, was mismanagement, that there's a lot of excess and poor management in the process. At the same time, you ask then if government doesn't do that function, should business do it? And they'll say no. Should individuals do it? Well, no. So I think until we, as the citizens, become united, or at least give some unified response to that question, I think the people who govern us are going to be just as confused. It's sort of like the devil is in the details. We can agree on some of the broad, general philosophy, but when you start applying it, then we see people break out into many, many groups, and there is no unifying force. We have gotten so far as to say mismanagement is a big problem. Who should manage it? The next question, if the federal government or the state government or the local government, because they lumped all governments together, although they do fear and are more angry of the federal government than they are the state and local government, then we're going to just sort of be at a standstill.
Other questions? Alan, did you have another question?
I had one follow-up to Andy's question. I'm just trying to sort out this internet business in my own life, and I'm fascinated by it. And I like to come to meetings, and I like to see people, and I feel a sense of community here. But what fascinates me about this online service is I can talk to someone in Maine and Texas, and it suddenly expands the possibilities. So I do recognize there's some possibility for a greater democracy there. Could you share your thoughts?
You're right. We can indeed have a town meeting and have everybody show up if they all have access to this technology, and that's the key. We could, in theory, all show up. We wouldn't see each other necessarily, but we could certainly participate in the process. So that opportunity is great. We can bring the federal government to Nebraska and Nebraska to the federal government, literally. So those kind of potentials are fantastic. The downside is access to the opportunity to have it, and it will be a self-selecting process whether I choose to join and participate, of course, as everything else. But you're right, the potential for good is there. Oftentimes we get frustrated with television and hear that it's been part of the problems with political campaigns because of the sound bites and because we don't meet the candidate and get to shake their hand and look them in the eye. But to say that we're not going to use television and candidates are not going to use television to campaign is an unbelievable concept. They're going to do it. So we need to find ways to make it a positive, to work positively for it. And I think online opportunities are there. We need to make sure that as we start down that path that we do that.
Eleanor Davis, club member. I'm interested in knowing how you assess the impact on this Congress of the national women's organizations. And secondly, will they have any impact on the Foster appointment?
Well, many of the women's organizations, the League does not support or oppose candidates or appointees, so we have not been involved in the process for any particular appointee, but many of the women's organizations do, and they have been very active in trying to impact on both sides of the aisle, frankly, on that issue. Many of the issues of concern to women are not, frankly, in the new Congress at this time. Those that are impact particularly women on the lesser economic scale, because most of the single-family parents are women, and they often are the ones who are on public assistance. So much of that debate is of concern, and of course, women's organizations and other organizations have been there trying to have that voice heard. children are also impacted by many of the decisions that will be made as we look at the deficit and deficit reduction. And again, they usually don't have someone representing them. They're not registered to vote. There isn't somebody looking at them. So it's often women's organizations and organizations that were created to represent children who will make an impact on that decision. But in many cases, much of the issues have been government issues. The line item veto, balanced budget amendment, term limits. Many of those items came up in the first 100 days. What happens now, I think, will sometimes be a frenzy as everybody tries to shove in now and get their item to percolate to the top.
Time for just a couple of more questions.
Ray Flanagan, there is a moral obligation to vote, and there are some countries in the world that have a requirement to vote. How about it? In Australia, you're required to vote, and if you don't vote, you're fined. I believe it's something like $50 or so. That's
true. Well, the League doesn't have a position on forcing you to vote. We do believe that you should vote. As you say, it's a moral obligation. It's a right and a responsibility, and we care deeply about it. The women who fought so hard to get us the right to vote founded our organization. We're proud to have the vote, and we want to extend it to everybody who's eligible. So obviously, we feel very strongly, very passionately about that. The countries that you mentioned do have a higher voting turnout too, because of those requirements. So there is a cause and effect maybe at that. Hopefully, as more citizens understand the power of their vote, we won't have to have that kind of even a discussion about it. And many of the constitutional rights that are given to us, including voting, are there for us to choose or not to choose. And you don't lose them necessarily, as with free speech. If you choose not to exercise your right to free speech, that doesn't mean you lose it. And the League feels the same way about voting. As much as we want you to, we feel very strongly that if you choose not to exercise it, you shouldn't lose that opportunity at some other time. So we like for you to be registered, stay registered, and participate.
Any takers for a final question? We haven't stumped her yet. Is there anyone who would have a final question?
Well, I have to say, I feel like I've been preaching to the choir because the City Club is so involved in the community and it demonstrates everything good about how the system can work, which is often the case. And yes.
I just wonder, could you say a word about the press and the present power or lack of power of the press in dealing with important political issues?
A word? No. Lots of words, yes. The press is often the way everyone communicates to everybody else, whether it be the print media, television, or radio. And they certainly do influence. Their description of what happened, their assessment of it certainly does impact and influence America. They have a critical role. They can play a good role. We saw some of that begin to change during the most recent '92 presidential election, where they decided to step in terms of analyzing ads, for example, and I know the Oregonian did it here, so that they can be the conveyor of information. Much of what they print is what we believe and we feel. Much of what they say on television and radio is what we believe or we feel. I have been on radio talk shows where a caller will call in and say, I can't believe the League is talking about that communist plot. And I'll say, why do you think this is a communist plot? And they'll say, well, so-and-so talk show host said it was. That those kinds of mediums have tremendous power. And as they are public and they can deliver wonderful opportunities, they can also be very negative in their approach. So I think they're beginning to see some of that. I know that the newspapers have begun to think about that, and hopefully so will television and the radio. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about whether radio can impact as much as, say, television or the print media. But who was it said that the pen was mightier than the sword? Words can make a difference.
Becky, I think I speak on behalf of the audience in saying that your presentation and your answers today certainly reinforce our belief of the importance of the voice of the League in this community and in the country. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.